23 years ago, struggling single mother Caroline Mercer was fired in disgrace from a prestigious law firm for one simple act of desperation, bringing her sick son to work when she had no one else to turn to. Branded irresponsible, quietly blacklisted, and left to scrape together a life far from the city, Caroline never spoke of that day again. Not to anyone. Not even to her now-grown son. But when a job unexpectedly opens at a private estate in Vermont, a reclusive, high-profile client seeking a discreet housekeeper, Caroline takes it, hoping for a fresh start, until she meets the man behind the locked study door. "I was that boy," he says. Subscribe to the channel and write a comment below where you are watching this video. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipping through the mail slot with an air of quiet importance. It was cream-colored, thick, and bore no return address. Just her name scrambled across the front in elegant cursive. Caroline Mercer. She frowned as she picked it up from the floor of her cramped apartment, running her thumb over the smooth paper. Something about its weight felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. She sat at her kitchen table, the one piece of furniture that wasn't second-hand or salvaged, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery, folded once. The handwriting inside matched the address on the envelope, precise, looping letters that seemed to belong to another era. "Dear Miss Mercer, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Eleanor Hargrove, and I am writing to offer you a position as live-in housekeeper for my estate in rural Vermont. The responsibilities would include light cleaning, meal preparation, and occasional errands. In exchange, I provide room, board, and a modest salary. I understand this may come as unexpected news, but your reputation precedes you. A mutual acquaintance recommended you highly. Please consider this opportunity carefully. If interested, kindly reply by week's end so arrangements can be made. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Hargrove." Caroline read the letter twice, then set it down slowly. Her hands hovered above the table, trembling faintly before she clasped them together to still them. Housekeeping? For some stranger in Vermont? She hadn't worked in years, not since the day everything fell apart, not since Owen was 8 years old, and she'd brought him to the office because there was nowhere else to leave him. That memory still clung to her like smoke, choking her when she least expected it. Her phone buzzed against the laminate countertop, startling her out of her thoughts. It was Owen. He always called on Tuesdays after work, his voice steady and kind, even though their conversations rarely strayed beyond pleasantries these days. "Hey, Mom," he said when she answered. "How's it going?" She hesitated, glancing at the letter. "Fine. Same old stuff." There was a pause, just long enough for her to imagine him frowning slightly on the other end. "You don't sound fine. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She forced brightness into her tone, hating how easily the lie came. "Just bills, you know, same story." Owen sighed. She could picture him leaning back in his chair, rubbing his temples. At 32, he carried the same weary expression she saw every morning in the mirror. "Mom, we've talked about this. You need to let me help more." "No," she said sharply, then softened. "I mean, no, thank you. You're doing enough already. I'll figure something out." Another pause. Then cautiously, "Did something happen?" She stared at the letter again, tracing the edge of the paper with her fingertip. "Actually, I got a job offer today." "What?" His surprise was palpable. "Doing what?" "Housekeeping, for some woman in Vermont." "Vermont?" He sounded skeptical. "Who is she? Do you know her?" "No idea." Caroline laughed nervously. "It's weird, right? But she says someone recommended me. Maybe one of Dad's old clients." "Maybe." Owen didn't sound convinced. Are you gonna take it? I don't know. She stood abruptly, pacing the narrow space between the table and the counter. It's not like I have a lot of options, Owen. And it's not forever, just until I get back on my feet. You sure this isn't some scam? He asked, gently. Because if money's tight, I can... I'm sure, she interrupted, sharper than she intended. Look, I'll think about it, okay? I'll call you tomorrow. After they hung up, Caroline sank back into her chair, staring at the letter again. Why now? Who was this Eleanor Hargrove, and why had she chosen her? The questions nagged at her, burrowing deep like splinters she couldn't quite reach. For the first time in years, Caroline allowed herself to think about the day her career ended. The day she'd walked into her law office holding Owen's hand, hoping no one would notice. She'd been desperate, cornered by circumstances she couldn't control. But desperation had consequences, and hers had been catastrophic. Clients left, colleagues whispered. Eventually, she quit before they could fire her, retreating into silence and shame. And yet here she was, decades later, being offered a chance to start over, even if it wasn't the life she'd imagined. Even if it meant leaving behind everything familiar. Caroline folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the blinds, casting thin bars of light across the worn linoleum floor. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to step into that light, to leave the shadows behind. But why her? Why now? Somewhere, in the quiet corners of her mind, a seed of doubt took root. The drive to Vermont had been long and uneventful, the kind of journey where the miles blur together and time seems to stretch thin. By the time Caroline turned onto the narrow, snow-lined road leading to the estate, dusk had settled over the landscape like a heavy velvet curtain. The trees stood sentinel on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the pale gray sky. As she crested a small hill, the house came into view. A sprawling mansion that seemed almost too grand for its secluded surroundings. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something unsettling about it. The windows stared out blankly, darkened mirrors reflecting nothing back. Snow clung stubbornly to the eaves and railings, untouched by human hands, as if nature itself hesitated to disturb the place. Caroline felt an involuntary shiver run down her spine as she parked her car in the circular driveway. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, isolated and impenetrable. A tall woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze greeted her at the door. She introduced herself as Sylvia, the house manager. Her handshake was firm, her tone clipped and efficient. "Welcome, Mrs. Mercer," she said without warmth. "Miss Hargrove regrets she couldn't meet you personally tonight, but I'll see to your orientation." Caroline nodded, clutching her coat tighter around her against the biting cold. "Thank you." Sylvia led her inside, and Caroline stepped into a grand foyer that smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust. The air was still, almost suffocating in its silence. Everything gleamed. Polished wood floors, crystal chandeliers, marble accents, but it all felt strangely lifeless, like a museum exhibit frozen in time. There were no family photos, no books left open on tables, no signs of habitation beyond the meticulous upkeep. "This way," Sylvia said, gesturing toward the staircase. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, each sound echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. They climbed to the second floor, where Sylvia showed her to a modest yet comfortable bedroom. "Your quarters," she announced briskly. "You'll find everything you need here." "Thank you," Caroline murmured again, though the words felt hollow. Something about this place made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps it was the oppressive quiet, or the way Sylvia avoided meeting her eyes, speaking only in terse, impersonal sentences. As they walked back downstairs, Sylvia stopped abruptly near a closed door at the end of the hallway. "This is the study," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "It's off limits, understood?" Caroline frowned, glancing at the door. It was unremarkable, save for the brass lock gleaming dully in the dim light. "Why is it locked?" "That's none of your concern," Sylvia replied coolly. "Just stay away from it. Miss Hargrove values her privacy." The warning hung in the air between them, heavy and unmistakable. Caroline nodded, though her curiosity burned brighter than ever. What could possibly be behind that door? And why go through such lengths to keep others out? Later that evening, after unpacking what little she'd brought with her, Caroline sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea. The house was silent now, save for the occasional creak of old wood settling. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but the feeling of being watched persisted, prickling the back of her neck like static electricity. She glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, she wandered aimlessly through the first floor, trying to memorize the layout of the house. Every room she entered seemed more sterile than the last. A formal dining room with chairs pushed neatly under the table, a sitting room with furniture draped in protective covers, a library lined with shelves of unread books. When she finally returned to the staircase, she froze. At the far end of the second-floor hallway, the study door loomed before her, darker than the rest of the shadows. But something was different now. A faint sliver of light seeped out from beneath the crack, illuminating the polished floorboards. Her heart thudded unevenly in her chest. Sylvia had said the study was always locked, and yet the light was on. Was someone inside, watching her? Before she could think better of it, Caroline took a step forward, her shoes making barely a sound on the carpeted stairs. Halfway up, she stopped, suddenly aware of how exposed she was in the open stairwell. If someone was watching, they would see her clearly. But then she heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep coming from somewhere above. Not hurried, not accidental. Someone, or something, was moving deliberately, purposefully. Caroline's breath hitched and she retreated quickly, retreating to the safety of her room. Once inside, she leaned against the closed door, her pulse racing. Who else was in this house? Why had Eleanor Hargrove hired her if she didn't even want her near half the rooms? And what secrets lay hidden behind that locked door? For the first time since arriving, Caroline considered turning around and leaving. But as she slid beneath the stiff covers of her bed, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, she knew she wouldn't. Whatever answers awaited her here, they called to her with an urgency she couldn't ignore. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees, rattling the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, sharp and final, like the closing of a chapter. The summons came on her third morning at the estate, delivered by Sylvia with her usual brisk efficiency. "Miss Hargrove requests your presence in the study," she announced, handing Caroline a small key. It gleamed dully in the light, its brass surface cool to the touch. Caroline stared at it, her stomach tightening. "Miss Hargrove? I thought—" "She's indisposed," Sylvia interrupted, her tone clipped. "You're to meet with Mr. Graham instead." "Mr. Graham?" The name caught in her throat like a splinter. She hadn't been told anyone else lived here, or worked here for that matter. But before she could ask more questions, Sylvia turned on her heel and disappeared down the hall, leaving Caroline alone with the weight of the key in her palm. She hesitated outside the study door, the sound of her own breathing unnervingly loud in the stillness. Finally, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The mechanism clicked open with surprising ease, and she pushed the door inward, stepping cautiously inside. The room was darker than she expected, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the midday sun. A single desk lamp illuminated a corner of the space, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Behind the desk sat a man in his early 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Please, have a seat." Caroline obeyed, perching awkwardly on the edge of the leather chair opposite him. Up close, there was something unsettlingly familiar about his face. The sharp jawline, the piercing eyes, but she couldn't place it. Not yet. "I assume you're wondering why you're here," he began, leaning back slightly in his chair. His movements were deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Let me start by saying this isn't a typical employer-employee relationship. You see, I've known about you for quite some time." His words sent a jolt through her chest, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Known about me?" He nodded, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "Your reputation precedes you, though perhaps not in the way you might think." He paused, studying her carefully. "I understand you used to practice law." Her breath hitched. That was a long time ago. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Before everything changed, before certain events led to your departure from the field." Caroline felt the blood drain from her face. How did he know? Who had told him? She opened her mouth to protest, to demand answers, but he spoke again before she could find the words. "You brought your son to work one day," he continued, his tone neutral, almost clinical. "Desperate circumstances, I imagine. And then—" He trailed off, letting the silence hang between them like a blade. It took every ounce of self-control not to bolt from the room. Instead, she forced herself to meet his gaze, searching for any hint of accusation or judgment. But his expression remained inscrutable. "I don't understand," she whispered finally. "Why are you telling me this?" For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, a fleeting vulnerability that softened his otherwise composed demeanor. "Because," he said quietly, "I was that boy." Time seemed to stop. Caroline's mind raced, sifting through memories buried so deep she'd convinced herself they no longer existed. The 8-year-old boy sitting quietly in the corner of her office while she argued with clients. The whispers that followed her out of conference rooms. The look on her boss's face when he called her into his office later that day. And now, staring back at her, was the grown version of that boy. Older, successful, composed, but unmistakably the same person. You were Owen's classmate?" she stammered, grasping at straws. Anything to make sense of this moment. He shook his head gently. "No, Mrs. Mercer, I wasn't his classmate. I was Owen." Her world tilted dangerously. "But that's impossible," she breathed. "My son, Owen, he's alive and well," he finished for her, his voice firm but gentle. "This isn't about him. This is about you. About what happened after." She wanted to argue, to deny it, but the truth pressed down on her like a physical weight. Graham's resemblance to Owen wasn't coincidental, it was exact. Every detail matched. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile, even the faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall. "But how?" she asked, her voice breaking. Why hire you?" He leaned forward, slightly, his elbows resting on the desk. "Because I needed to see you. To understand why you left, why you gave up." "I didn't give up." The words burst out her, raw and unfiltered. I had no choice." "Do we ever truly have no choice?" he countered softly. "Or do we simply convince ourselves of that to avoid facing our mistakes?" His question struck her like a blow, forcing her to confront the guilt she'd carried for decades. She had told herself it was circumstance, necessity, bad luck, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had failed, not just as a lawyer, but as a mother. Graham must have seen the turmoil in her eyes because his expression softened further. "You've done enough for today," he said, standing and gesturing toward the door. "We'll speak again soon." She rose shakily to her feet, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. As she reached the doorway, she turned back, desperate for clarity. "Why now?" she asked. "After all these years, why bring me here?" He regarded her for a long moment, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Because sometimes," he said finally, "the only way to move forward is to revisit the past." With that, he closed the door behind her, leaving her alone in the dim hallway. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest as she made her way back to her room, each step heavier than the last. What had she walked into? And what secrets was Graham hiding behind that composed exterior? As she lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, one thought echoed relentlessly in her mind. If Graham really was Owen, if he somehow represented the life her son might have led, then who exactly was the man she'd raised? The days at the estate blurred together, each one marked by quiet routines and unanswered questions. Caroline tried to focus on her tasks, cleaning, cooking, maintaining order in a house that seemed determined to resist it, but her mind kept circling back to Graham. His words haunted her, as did his resemblance to Owen. Was he truly her son? Or was this some cruel twist of fate, a trick of memory and circumstance? It was during one of these restless afternoons, while dusting a rarely used guest room on the second floor, that she stumbled upon something that stopped her cold. The room was sparsely furnished, its air tinged with the faint scent of cedar and neglect. She worked methodically, running a cloth over the surfaces until her hand brushed against the edge of a desk drawer left slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of her. She opened the drawer fully, revealing a jumble of forgotten items. Pens dried out from disuse, a stack of yellowed stationery, and tucked into the corner a photograph. Her breath caught as she picked it up. It was an old group photo, faded but familiar, the kind taken for company newsletters or holiday cards. And there she was, younger, smiling hesitantly among her colleagues from the law firm. They stood in front of the building's marbled entrance, dressed in suits and polished shoes, their faces frozen in time. But it wasn't her own face that held her attention. Standing near the front of the group was a boy, no older than 8 or 9, with neatly combed hair and a cautious smile. Graham, or rather Owen, as he might have looked 2 decades ago. Her fingers trembled as she traced the outline of his figure. There was no mistaking him now, every detail matched. But then her gaze shifted, and she noticed something else, a second child standing beside him, partially cropped out of the frame. Only half of the child's body remained visible. A small shoulder, the curve of a cheek, the hint of a grin. The rest had been torn away, leaving jagged edges where the image once continued. Who was this other child? Why had they been removed so deliberately? Caroline turned the photograph over, hoping for answers scrawled on the back. Instead, she found only a single word written in neat block letters. Remember. A chill ran down her spine. Remember what? The past? The choices she'd made? The life she'd abandoned? She stared at the fragmented image, trying to piece together fragments of her own memory. Had there been another child at the firm that day? Someone she'd overlooked or forgotten? The more she thought about it, the hazier the details became. Time and guilt had eroded so much of her recollection, leaving only shadows behind. And yet, the presence of the photograph here, in this house, in this drawer, felt deliberate, as if someone wanted her to find it, wanted her to ask questions. Her thoughts drifted to Graham. Could he have placed it there? If so, why? Was this part of his plan, to force her to confront not just her failures, but the people she'd left behind? She slipped the photograph into her pocket, intending to return it later, though she knew she wouldn't. Not yet. For now, it felt like evidence, proof that the threads of her past were unraveling faster than she could follow them. That night, as she lay awake in her narrow bed, the photograph resting on the bedside table, she allowed herself to imagine what might have happened to the other child. Were they still alive? Had they thrived, like Graham seemed to have done? Or had their lives taken darker turns, shaped by forces beyond their control? Somewhere in the distance, the wind howled softly, rattling the window panes. Caroline pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on her. This place wasn't just isolated, it was suffocating, filled with secrets that refused to stay buried. She closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. All she could see was the torn photograph, the missing face staring back at her like a ghost. Who was the other child? And why did it feel like the answer mattered more than anything else? In the silence of the night, one thing became clear. The closer she came to uncovering the truth, the less certain she was of who she could trust, including herself. The house had a way of playing tricks on her mind, its creaks and groans weaving themselves into patterns that felt almost deliberate. By her 5th day at the estate, Caroline had grown accustomed to the odd noises, the settling wood, the wind whistling through cracks in the windows, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw late one evening. It happened as she was making her way to the kitchen for a glass of water. The main staircase loomed ahead, bathed in the soft glow of a wall sconce, but something drew her toward the narrower, less used back stairwell instead. It was darker there, the light barely reaching the first few steps before fading into shadow. As she passed, movement caught the corner of her eye. A flicker, fleeting and faint. She froze, her breath hitching. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection from the snow outside or the sway of branches against the window. But then, she saw it again. A small figure standing halfway up the stairs, silhouetted against the dim light. A child. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. For a moment, all she could do was stare, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Then, slowly, the silhouette turned and disappeared into the upper hallway, vanishing without a sound. Caroline's pulse roared in her ears. She hesitated only a second before rushing up the stairs after it, her footsteps quick and uneven on the worn carpet. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched empty before her. Doors closed tight, no sign of anyone or anything having been there. "Wait," she called again, though her voice came out softer this time, hesitant. "Please." But there was nothing. Only silence, thick and suffocating. She stood there for several long moments, clutching the railing with white-knuckled hands, until finally, reluctantly, she descended back to the ground floor. Her thoughts raced, each possibility more unsettling than the last. Could it have been Graham? No, he was too old, too composed to be mistaken for a child. Sylvia, perhaps? But Sylvia avoided the back stairwell entirely, preferring the grandeur of the main staircase. When she found Sylvia in the kitchen the next morning, sorting through a stack of neatly folded linens, Caroline decided to ask. "I saw someone last night," she began cautiously, leaning against the counter. "A child, I think, on the back stairs." Sylvia paused mid-fold, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "A child?" "Yes," Caroline nodded, feeling suddenly foolish under the other woman's scrutiny. "Or maybe, I don't know, maybe I imagined it." "There are no children here," Sylvia said flatly, returning to her task. Her tone left no room for argument. "Mr. Graham lives alone." Alone. The word echoed in Caroline's mind, cold and hollow. She wanted to press further, to ask if anyone else had ever lived in the house, a family, a relative, but Sylvia's demeanor made it clear the conversation was over. Later, as she went about her duties, Caroline couldn't shake the image of the silhouette from her mind. Who, or what, had she seen? Was it possible her guilt was manifesting itself in hallucinations, conjuring ghosts where none existed? She'd read enough stories of grief warping reality to consider it. After all, hadn't she spent years burying memories, locking them away like the study door upstairs? Perhaps this was her subconscious forcing her to confront those shadows. And yet, the figure had seemed so real, so solid, not like a memory, but like a presence. That night, unable to sleep, she sat by the window in her room, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. The moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and blue, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. For a while, she allowed herself to believe it might have been her imagination, a fleeting glimpse of the past brought to life by exhaustion and fear. But then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw it again. This time, not inside the house, but outside. A small figure darting between the trees, quick and silent as a wisp of smoke. It vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Caroline's throat tightened. Whatever, or whoever it wasn't part of her mind. Something was here with her, watching, waiting, and it knew far more about her than she did about it. As she pulled the curtains shut, sealing herself off from the night, one thought lingered stubbornly in her mind. If this wasn't a ghost, then who was it? And why did it feel like it was leading her somewhere? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving her more unsettled than ever. But deep down, beneath the fear and confusion, she felt a flicker of resolve. Whoever, or whatever, was haunting these halls, it held the key to the mystery she'd come here to solve, and she wouldn't leave until she uncovered the truth. The attic was a place of forgotten things, its air thick with dust and the faint scent of aged wood. Caroline had been instructed to clear out some of the older items stored there, though she suspected it was more to keep her occupied than out of any real necessity. Still, she welcomed the distraction. The house felt increasingly suffocating, and the work gave her hands something to do while her mind churned over unanswered questions. It was near the back corner of the space that she found it. An old steamer trunk. Its surface scratched and weathered, but otherwise unremarkable. What caught her attention wasn't the trunk itself, but the label affixed to its lid in faded black ink. Case hash 471B. Something about those numbers stirred a memory deep within her, like the echo of a sound long silenced. She knelt beside it, brushing away cobwebs before lifting the lid. Inside, neatly stacked and tied with fraying ribbon, were bundles of papers yellowed with age. Her breath caught as she untied one bundle and began sifting through the contents. They were carbon copies of legal documents, contracts, memos, correspondence, all bearing her name. But it was the letters that stopped her cold. Each envelope was addressed to Harold Whitmore, the senior partner at her old firm, and each bore her signature scrawled across the bottom of the enclosed pages. She recognized her own handwriting immediately, though it seemed foreign now, belonging to a version of herself she barely remembered. As she read through them, her chest tightened with a mixture of grief and shame. "Mr. Whitmore," one letter began, "I understand the gravity of my mistake, and I assure you it will not happen again. Please believe me when I say I am committed to this firm and to rectifying whatever damage has been done." Another pleaded even more desperately. "I know bringing Owen into the office was unprofessional, but I had nowhere else to turn. My ex-husband refused to take him, and daycare was impossible on short notice. I beg you to consider my circumstances before making any final decisions." And then, tucked near the bottom of the stack, a letter that made her stomach churn. "There's something else I need to confess. The boy who saw Owen, he told me he heard things he shouldn't have. Conversations between clients, details of cases. I'm terrified of what might happen if anyone finds out. I don't know what to do." Her hands trembled as she set the letters aside, her vision blurring with tears. These words, her words, had never reached their intended recipient. She would have remembered sending them, remembered fighting for her career, for her dignity. But instead, they'd been intercepted, hidden away in this trunk like secrets too dangerous to see the light of day. Who had done this, and why? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't been fired because of negligence or incompetence. She'd been pushed out deliberately, silenced before she could expose whatever truths lay buried beneath the polished veneer of her former workplace. Someone had ensured these letters never reached Harold Whitmore, and someone had wanted her gone. A wave of loneliness washed over her, heavier than anything she'd felt in years. At the time, she'd convinced herself she was alone because of her choices, her failures. But now, faced with tangible proof of betrayal, she understood the truth. She hadn't just lost her job. She'd been abandoned by people she trusted, people who should have stood by her. As she sat amidst the dusty relics of the past, clutching the fragile pages in trembling hands, a single thought crystallized in her mind. Whoever controlled this house, this estate, knew far more than they were letting on. This wasn't just about Graham. It wasn't just about her. There was a larger conspiracy here, threads connecting her to the firm, to the missing child in the photograph, to the ghostly figure haunting the stairwell. And somehow, case hash 471B was at the center of it all. Caroline carefully retied the ribbon around the bundle of letters and placed them back in the trunk. For now, she would leave them where they were, untouched, but not forgotten. Whatever answers she sought, they weren't ready to reveal themselves yet. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to cry, silent tears tracking down her cheeks as the weight of decades-old isolation pressed down on her. She had come to Vermont seeking redemption, but instead she'd uncovered wounds she thought had healed long ago. As she descended from the attic, the trunk's label burned in her mind like a brand. Case hash 471B. 4 simple characters that held the key to everything. Now, she just needed to find the lock. It was the faintest scent that drew her attention. A metallic tang, like rust or old blood, that lingered just beyond the threshold of the pantry. Caroline had been restocking shelves when it hit her. Sharp and unexpected, slicing through the usual sterile stillness of the house. She paused, frowning, and turned toward the far wall. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it. Smooth wooden paneling, slightly warped with age, blending seamlessly into the rest of the room. But as she stepped closer, something caught her eye. a hairline crack running vertically down the center of the panels, barely visible unless you were standing directly in front of it. And then she noticed the scratches on the floorboards at its base. Shallow grooves gouged into the wood as though someone, or something, had dragged heavy objects across them recently. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't an ordinary wall, it was a door. She pressed her palm against the surface, feeling for any give, but it didn't budge. There was no handle, no lock, just the faint outline of what lay hidden behind it. A basement? Or something else entirely? When Sylvia appeared later that afternoon, clipboard in hand, Caroline seized the opportunity to ask. "What's behind this door?" she said casually, nodding toward the pantry. Sylvia glanced over, her expression unreadable. "That? Nothing. It's sealed." "Sealed?" Caroline echoed, feigning curiosity. "Why?" "It hasn't been opened in years," Sylvia replied curtly, moving past her to inspect the contents of the pantry. "Miss Hargrove prefers it that way." "But," Caroline hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I saw scratches on the floor, like someone's been trying to open it." Sylvia stiffened, her back to Caroline as she adjusted a jar of preserves with unnecessary precision. "You must be mistaken," she said without turning around. "No one go near that door." Caroline let the matter drop, though the unease gnawing at her stomach only grew stronger. That night, as she lay awake in her room, the silence of the house seemed heavier than ever. The wind outside whispered against the windows, but beneath it, barely audible, almost imperceptible, was another sound. Soft, melodic notes drifting upward from somewhere deep below. A piano. Her breath caught. The music was faint, fragmented, as if played by hesitant hands. Each note hung suspended in the air before dissolving into silence, leaving behind an ache that felt both familiar and foreign. She sat up slowly, straining to listen. It wasn't coming from within the house. It was rising from underneath it. Her heart thundered in her chest as she slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the hallway. The sound grew clearer as she approached the pantry, pulling her inexorably toward the sealed door. She pressed her ear against the cool wood, her fingers brushing the edges instinctively. The melody faltered, then stopped altogether, plunging the house back into suffocating quiet. The next morning, unable to shake the memory of the haunting tune, she confronted Graham during their scheduled meeting in the study. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression calm but guarded. "There's something I need to ask you," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling inside her. "About the basement." His pen stilled mid-stroke, and for a moment he simply stared at her. Then, slowly, he set it down. "What about it?" "I heard music last night," she said, "coming from beneath the house, from behind the sealed door." Graham's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his tone remained level. "You shouldn't concern yourself with what's down there." "Why not?" she pressed, taking a step closer. "What's in the basement?" For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that sent a chill down her spine. "There are things in this house that belong to no one," he said quietly. "Things best left undisturbed." "What does that mean?" she demanded, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Who's playing the piano? Who or what is down there?" He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, and walked to the window. His silhouette was stark against the gray light filtering through the drapes. "It doesn't matter who," he said at last. "Or what. All that matters is that some doors should never be opened." His words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Caroline wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in his demeanor stopped her. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was resignation, as if he'd already tried to fight whatever secrets the house held and lost. As she left the study, the sound of the piano echoed faintly in her mind, each note a reminder of how much she didn't know. The basement door loomed larger in her thoughts now, its presence oppressive, suffocating. Whatever lay beyond it was tied to everything. The letters, the photograph, the child in the stairwell. And yet, as terrified as she was, she couldn't ignore the pull it exerted on her. The truth was down there, waiting. But at what cost would she find it? Caroline hadn't expected to find solace in conversation, but the groundskeeper, an elderly man named Walter who tended to the estate's sprawling gardens, proved to be a surprising comfort. He arrived early one morning, bundled against the biting cold, his boots crunching through the thin layer of fresh snow blanketing the grounds. She watched him from the kitchen window as he worked, methodically clearing paths and pruning dead branches, until finally, curiosity got the better of her. "Morning," she called out as she stepped onto the porch, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "Need any help?" Walter glanced up, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. "Not unless you've got a green thumb I don't know about," he replied, leaning on his rake. His voice carried the soft cadence of someone accustomed to long silences. They fell into easy conversation, talking about the weather, the stubborn frost that refused to yield, and eventually, the history of the estate itself. Caroline seized the opportunity to ask questions she'd been too afraid or too alone to voice before. "This place feels so old," she ventured carefully. "Has it always been like this? So isolated?" Walter chuckled, though there was a sadness in his eyes that gave her pause. "Oh, it's seen its share of life all right. Back in the day, it was a different story. Folks used to gather here for parties, holidays, you name it. But that was before—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "Before what?" she prompted gently. He hesitated, glancing toward the house as if weighing whether or not to speak. Finally, he sighed. "There used to be a grave on this property," he said quietly. "A child's grave, long time ago." Her breath hitched. "A child? Who was it?" "No one knows anymore," Walter admitted, brushing snow off a nearby bench and gesturing for her to sit. "The marker disappeared years back. Some say it was moved, others claim it was erased altogether. Either way, no trace of it remains now." "Erased?" The word felt heavy in her mouth, echoing uncomfortably with the secrets she'd uncovered so far. Why would someone do that? Walter shrugged, his expression unreadable. "People erase things when they want to forget, or when they're ashamed." He paused, studying her carefully. "You look troubled, ma'am. Is something bothering you?" She wanted to tell him everything. The letters, the photograph, the piano music rising from beneath the house. But the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she forced a smile. "Just trying to make sense of this place," she said lightly. "It has a way of keeping its secrets." After their chat, Caroline retreated to the library, where she spent hours poring over dusty archives and local records stored in the estate's collection. Her hands trembled as she flipped through brittle pages, searching for anything related to the firm, the photograph, or the missing child. It wasn't until late afternoon that she found it. A faded newspaper clipping tucked inside an old ledger. The article was brief, barely more than a paragraph, but it sent a jolt through her chest. On the day she brought Owen to the office, another child had been present. A girl. Her name, however, was redacted, replaced by a blackened smudge that obliterated even the first letter. Caroline stared at the page, her mind racing. 2 children. 2 witnesses. If Graham, or rather Owen, was one of them, then who was the other? And why had her name been erased? The implications were staggering. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the second child remained anonymous, just as they had removed her image from the photograph and buried the grave on the property. Every clue led back to the same conclusion: erasure. Whoever controlled this house, and perhaps her former firm, had systematically wiped away evidence of the girl's existence. But why? As night fell, Caroline sat by the fire in the sitting room, the clipping clutched tightly in her hand. The weight of it pressed down on her, heavier than any physical object should. Erasure was more than absence. It was denial, a refusal to acknowledge the truth. And yet, the harder someone tried to bury it, the louder it seemed to scream for attention. Her thoughts drifted to the sealed basement door, the ghostly figure on the stairs, the haunting piano melody. Was the girl connected to all of it? Had she been silenced too? For the first time since arriving at the estate, Caroline allowed herself to consider the possibility that the answers she sought weren't just about her past. They were about someone else's. Someone who might still be trapped here, unable to move on. And if that was true, then opening the basement door wasn't just dangerous. It could be an act of liberation. Or destruction. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls, Caroline resolved to find out. Whatever, or whoever, was waiting for her below, she couldn't turn away now. Not when the truth was so close she could almost touch it. The house was silent except for the faint, ghostly notes of the piano drifting upward from the depths below. Caroline stood in the pantry, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the hidden seam of the basement door. She had spent hours searching the estate for a key, finally finding one tucked inside an antique clock in the library, a place no one would think to look unless they were desperate. The lock clicked open with a soft groan, and she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The scent hit her first. Musty air tinged with something metallic, like rust or old blood, mingling with the faint aroma of lavender. It was oddly familiar, stirring memories she couldn't quite grasp. Steeling herself, she pushed the door open and descended into the darkness. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her weight, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the confined space. A single bulb hung from the ceiling at the bottom, casting weak light over a room frozen in time. Dust clung to every surface, coating furniture draped in protective sheets and boxes stacked haphazardly along the walls. Toys lay scattered across the floor. Dolls with cracked porcelain faces, a rusted tricycle, a jigsaw puzzle missing half its pieces. But it wasn't the toys that caught her attention. It was the mirror propped against the far wall, its glass clouded with age but still reflecting the dim light. Taped to its surface was a child's drawing, faded but legible. 3 figures stood side by side, their stick figure forms adorned with crude details. 2 boys and a girl holding hands. Beneath them, scrawled in uneven block letters, were the words, "Me, Owen, and Graham." Caroline's heart stopped. Her vision blurred as she staggered forward, reaching out to steady herself against the wall. She stared at the drawing, her mind reeling. 2 boys, Owen and Graham. That part made sense. But the girl, who was she? Why hadn't she remembered her? And then it came rushing back, unbidden and sharp, a fragment of memory buried so deeply she'd convinced herself it didn't exist. Owen, sitting in the back seat of the car after daycare, his small voice hesitant. "There was this girl today, Mom. She cried all the time. I don't think anyone liked her." At the time, she'd dismissed it, distracted by her own worries and the chaos of single parenthood. Hadn't even asked for the girl's name. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the cold concrete floor, clutching the drawing to her chest. What had she missed? What had she failed to see? The realization hit her like a freight train. The girl hadn't just been present at the firm that day. She had been central to whatever happened. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase her from history, redacting her name, removing her face from photographs, hiding evidence of her very existence. And yet, here she was, immortalized in crayon on a piece of paper, refusing to be forgotten. Caroline's gaze swept the room again, taking in the remnants of a life interrupted. Among the clutter, she noticed a small wooden music box resting on a nearby table. Its lid was carved with intricate floral patterns, delicate and feminine. She reached for it, her fingers brushing away layers of dust. Inside, nestled among faded velvet lining, was a tiny brass key and a folded note. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper, revealing a single sentence written in looping cursive. "They told me not to tell." Who had written it? The girl, or someone else trying to protect her? The ambiguity gnawed at Caroline, filling her with a mixture of grief and fury. How many secrets had been kept from her? From everyone. She turned the music box over in her hands, examining it closely. When she wound the key and lifted the lid, the faint melody of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" filled the air. A tune both achingly familiar and unbearably sad. It was the same song she'd heard rising from the basement those nights, haunting her dreams and pulling her closer to the truth. Tears streamed down her face as she sat amidst the relics of a forgotten past, the weight of what she'd uncovered pressing down on her like a stone. This wasn't just about her guilt or her failures anymore. It was about justice. For the girl whose name had been erased. For the child who cried all the time. For the fragments of lives left behind in this house. As the music faded into silence, Caroline resolved to find out who the girl was, and why she had been silenced. Whatever it took, she would uncover the truth. Because some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The confrontation came on a stormy evening, the kind where the wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows like angry fists. Caroline had waited long enough, her patience fraying with each unanswered question. She found Graham in the study, seated at his desk as always, his posture rigid but his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said firmly, closing the door behind her. Her voice carried an edge she hadn't intended, but it was too late to soften it now. Graham looked up, startled by her tone. "Caroline." "No," she interrupted, stepping closer. "I've spent weeks uncovering pieces of this puzzle, and I'm done guessing. You owe me the truth." He hesitated, his jaw tightening before he exhaled sharply. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, might retreat behind the same cold composure that had defined their interactions thus far. But then something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, raw and unguarded, and he nodded slowly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to know." She sat across from him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavy with unspoken words. Outside, thunder rumbled ominously, punctuating the silence between them. "Her name was Lily," he began, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "My sister. She was 6 years old. The day everything changed." Caroline's breath hitched. "Lily, the girl in the drawing?" "Yes." He nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk as if seeking stability. "She was there that day. You brought Owen and my mother. She let Lily come to the office because she thought it would be easier than finding childcare last minute. We were supposed to stay out of the way, keep quiet. But Lily—" His voice cracked, and he paused, swallowing hard. "She wandered off. No one noticed until it was too late." "What happened?" Caroline whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. "There was an incident. A fire alarm. Or maybe something worse. The building was evacuated, chaos everywhere. When they realized Lily was missing—" He shook his head, his knuckles white against the polished wood. "They searched for hours, but she was gone. Vanished without a trace." Her stomach churned, nausea rising in waves as the pieces fell into place. And I was blamed. Graham met her eyes then, his own filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "Not directly, no. But you were vulnerable. They knew your position wasn't secure. Bringing Owen to work made you an easy target. A scapegoat. My parents. They took the settlement offered by the firm, agreed to stay silent about what really happened, and you—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "I lost everything," she said hollowly, the weight of those years crashing down on her all at once. "My career, my reputation. I thought it was my fault. That I'd failed." "You didn't fail," he insisted, leaning forward urgently. "None of it was your fault. It was theirs, the firm, my family, everyone who chose to protect themselves instead of telling the truth. They erased Lily, not just from the records but from memory, like she never existed." Tears spilled down her cheeks unchecked, mirroring the ones streaming down his face. In that moment, the barriers between them crumbled, leaving only shared grief and regret. Two lives shattered by the same tragedy, yet separated by secrets and lies. "Why bring me here now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "After all these years?" "Because I needed answers," he confessed. "Because I wanted to understand why you left, why no one fought for you. And because—" he hesitated, his voice breaking. "Because I hoped you could help me find her. Somewhere inside, I still believe she's alive." The room seemed to shrink further, the walls closing in around them as the enormity of his confession sank in. Lily, the girl who cried all the time, the child whose name had been redacted, whose face had been torn from photographs, was more than just a ghost haunting the halls of this house. She was a sister, a daughter, a life cut short or hidden away. Caroline reached across the desk, placing her hand over his. "We'll find her," she vowed, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "Together." For the first time since arriving at the estate, she felt a glimmer of hope, not for redemption, but for justice. Whatever it took, she would uncover the truth about Lily, because some losses couldn't be undone, but they could be acknowledged, and perhaps, in doing so, they could begin to heal. The discovery came on a morning thick with frost, the kind that clung to the windows like a second skin and muffled the world outside. Caroline and Graham had spent the night combing through the basement, their movements fueled by desperation and the fragile hope of finding answers. The air was heavy with dust and the metallic tang of old secrets, each breath catching in their throats as they worked. It was Graham who noticed it first, a faint line etched into the plaster of one wall, barely visible beneath layers of grime. He ran his fingers along its edge, his touch hesitant at first, then urgent. "This wasn't here before," he murmured, more to himself than to Caroline. She stepped closer, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" "A seam," he said, pressing harder against the wall. "Help me." Together, they pushed and pried until the brittle plaster began to crumble, revealing rough wooden planks nailed tightly together. Behind them lay something long concealed, untouched for decades. The scent that wafted out was unmistakable, decay, mingled with the faint sweetness of lavender. It hit Caroline like a punch to the gut, rooting her to the spot. Graham didn't hesitate. With trembling hands, he tore away the boards, exposing a narrow alcove hidden within the wall. Inside, the room was small, no larger than a closet, its contents frozen in time. A child's coat hung limply from a hook, its fabric faded but still recognizable. Beneath it lay toys, a doll missing an arm, a tin truck rusted beyond repair, and scattered across the floor were fragments of paper, crayon drawings yellowed with age. But it was what rested in the corner that stopped them both cold. Bones. Tiny, delicate bones, half buried beneath the debris of a life cut tragically short. A single shoe lay nearby, its sole worn thin, as if it had once carried a child running toward safety, or trying desperately to escape. Caroline staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her vision blurred, tears streaming down her face as the truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. This was Lily, the girl who cried all the time. The nameless figure erased from photographs, redacted from records, buried so deeply even her family had been silenced. "She hid here," Graham whispered, his voice breaking, when the alarm went off. She must have panicked, hid in this little space thinking it would keep her safe. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his hands clutching the edge of the coat as if holding on to the last piece of his sister he'd ever touch. "And no one looked for her," Caroline said hoarsely, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "They evacuated the building, called it an accident, paid everyone off to stay quiet. And I—" She choked on the sentence, unable to finish. "You weren't part of it," Graham insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "You weren't there when they decided to cover it up. By the time anyone realized she was missing, you were already gone, fired, blamed." "But I could have helped," she cried, sinking down beside him. "If I'd known, if someone had told me." "They didn't want you to know," he said bitterly. "No one did, that's how they work. The firm, my parents, all of them. They bury the truth so deep it can't claw its way back to the surface. Except," he gestured toward the tiny remains in the corner, "except sometimes it does." The weight of it pressed down on them, suffocating and unrelenting. Institutional betrayal masked as efficiency, disguised as necessity. Lives destroyed. Not just Lily's, but theirs too. Careers ruined. Families fractured, memories erased. All in the name of protecting reputations and preserving appearances. Caroline reached out, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of the coat. "We can't let them win," she said fiercely, her voice steadying despite the storm raging inside her. "Lily deserves better than this. She deserves to be remembered." Graham nodded, tears streaming down his face as he gathered the coat into his arms. "We'll tell her story," he vowed. "Every last detail, no matter what it costs us." As they sat amidst the remnants of a forgotten tragedy, the enormity of the moment settled over them like ash. The truth had been uncovered, laid bare in all its heartbreaking clarity, but the cost of silence, the human toll of decisions made behind closed doors, would haunt them forever. And yet, even in the shadow of such loss, there was a glimmer of resolve. For the first time, Caroline felt something other than guilt or grief. She felt purpose. Whatever happened next, she would ensure Lily's voice was heard, because some truths, no matter how painful, demanded to be spoken. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet resolution. Graham handled the aftermath with a grace that surprised even himself. There were no press conferences, No sensational headlines, just a discreet phone call to the authorities, who arrived at the estate one gray morning to document what remained of Lily's tragic fate. The bones were carefully collected, labeled, and taken away, their presence finally acknowledged after decades of silence. Caroline watched from the window as the forensic team packed up their equipment and drove off down the long, winding driveway. She felt an odd sense of detachment, as though she were observing someone else's life rather than her own. The weight of guilt that had anchored her for so long was gone, replaced by something lighter, but no less profound: acceptance. Graham joined her later that afternoon, his face pale but composed. He held a steaming mug of tea in his hands, offering it to her wordlessly before pouring himself a second cup. They sat together in the sitting room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, neither speaking for a long while. "I didn't want this to become a spectacle," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Lily deserves peace, not chaos." "She'll have it," Caroline replied, her voice steady. "You've given her back her name." He nodded, staring into the flames. "I searched for you because, well, not because I blamed you. Far from it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You were the only adult that day who saw me, who tried to help. Even after everything happened, I remembered how you looked at me, not with pity or judgment, but like I mattered." Her throat tightened, and she reached out to squeeze his hand. "You did matter, Graham. You always did." For the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly believe it, not just about him, but about herself. She hadn't failed Lily or Owen or anyone else. She'd been human, flawed and vulnerable, caught in a web of decisions made by others far more powerful. And now, finally, she could let go. That evening, she called Owen. His voice answered on the third ring, warm and familiar. "Hey, Mom," he said, concern creeping into his tone when he heard the slight tremor in hers. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said, surprising even herself with the clarity in her voice. "Not anymore." She told him everything: the estate, the letters, the photograph, the girl named Lily. She left nothing out, her words flowing freely for the first time in decades. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Wow," Owen said softly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied, smiling faintly. "Just thank you for believing in me, for telling me to take this job, even when I didn't think I could." There was another pause then. "I'm proud of you, Mom." The words brought tears to her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness this time. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, for her son, for Graham, for the chance to make things right. Days later, as she prepared to leave the estate for good, Caroline found the final letter waiting for her on the kitchen table. It was tucked inside a plain white envelope, its edges crisp and unmarked. Her name was typed neatly across the front, just like the first letter she'd received all those weeks ago. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching as she read the single line scrawled across the page. "You were never supposed to find her, but I'm glad you did." Her heart pounded as she turned the paper over, searching for any sign of who might have sent it. There was none. No signature, no return address, just the faint impression of keys pressed into thick, textured paper. A typewriter. And then it hit her. The attic. The trunk labeled case hash 471B. She'd seen it during her search, an old manual typewriter, dusty but functional, tucked among the forgotten items stored there. Whoever had written the letter knew the house intimately, knew its secrets, and hers. She set the note down carefully, her mind racing. Was this a warning, a confession, or simply an acknowledgement that justice, however imperfect, had been served? As she stood in the doorway of the estate one final time, looking out over the snow-covered grounds, she realized it didn't matter. Some questions would remain unanswered, some mysteries unsolved, but for the first time in her life, Caroline felt at peace. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of laughter. A child's laugh, light and carefree. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. "Goodbye, Lily," she murmured softly. "Rest now." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving the house and its ghosts behind.